The dark secret behind a family's vacation gone wrong. Hook. What would you do if you were trapped in a forest, surrounded by shadows and an ancient evil, with no way out? In this spine-chilling adventure, a mother and daughter fight to survive against terrifying forces beyond imagination. But just when they think they've escaped, the darkness returns stronger than ever. Will they make it out alive, or will the shadows claim them forever? Stay tuned until the end to discover the shocking truth. This hook is designed to grab attention, raise questions, and create suspense, compelling viewers to keep watching. The sun had barely set when they arrived at the cabin. The air smelled thick with pine and damp earth. It was supposed to be the perfect vacation, a break from the hustle. The family, tired and eager for rest, unloaded the car. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. Old, worn wooden planks creaked beneath their feet. The door groaned open with an unsettling sound. Inside, the air was cool, heavy with dust. The living room was dark, save for the glow from a lone lamp. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. It felt off, not quite right. The children, excited at first, immediately explored the house. The parents, tired from the drive, sat down on the couch. They chatted briefly, but their voices seemed distant, almost muffled. It was as if the house itself was swallowing their words. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, a chill crept in. The crackling of the fireplace was the only sound breaking the silence. But then there was a soft thud from upstairs. The parents froze. They exchanged a glance, both confused and curious. Probably just the house settling, the father said. But the mother wasn't so sure. She got up, walked toward the stairs, her steps slow, careful. She peered up into the darkness. Nothing moved, but the sense of unease grew. Her hand gripped the railing. The noise came again, a soft shuffle, like footsteps. She called out, "Emily? Jake?" No answer. Her heart began to race. Something felt wrong. She turned to her husband. "Stay here," she whispered. Up the stairs she went, each step creaking louder than the last. The house felt alive. She reached the top. The hallway was empty. No sign of the children. Her breath caught in her throat. She walked down the corridor. Each door was closed, silent, but one door at the end was slightly ajar. She pushed it open. Inside was nothing but a small room, empty except for dust and old furniture. But on the floor, something gleamed. A piece of jewelry. The mother's heart skipped a beat. It was Emily's necklace. She picked it up, fingers trembling. Suddenly, the air grew colder. The hairs on her neck stood up. A sound echoed from behind her. She spun around, but there was nothing. The room was still, but it didn't feel empty anymore. A whisper, barely audible. "Help me." Her pulse quickened. The house seemed to close in on her. Where were the kids? She dashed back down the stairs. Her husband was gone. The front door wide open. Outside, nothing. Just the trees, dark, silent. Her heart pounded. She stepped into the night, calling their names. But the only sound was the wind. Then a flash. A shadow darting between the trees. Her body froze. The whisper again. "Help me." The voice was clear now, but it was far. Too far. She ran towards the woods, her feet slipping on the wet ground. The darkness felt alive. The trees seemed to close in around her. Suddenly a scream. Sharp. Her blood ran cold. It was Emily. She was close. Too close. The woods swallowed her footsteps as she moved faster. The sound of rustling leaves. The crack of twigs underfoot. She was almost there. Then nothing. Complete silence. A clearing ahead. She stopped. In the center of the clearing stood her daughter. But something was wrong. Emily was staring at her with wide, unblinking eyes. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Her hands were outstretched, and the forest was still, a cold, oppressive stillness. The wind had stopped. The trees were silent. Her daughter motionless. She reached for her, trembling, but as her fingers brushed against Emily's skin, it felt wrong. The warmth of her body was gone. It was cold, too cold, and in that moment, a horrible realization sank in. Emily wasn't there. What stood before her wasn't Emily. It was something else, something that wore her face. A voice, hollow and distant, echoed through the trees. "Help me." It wasn't her daughter's voice. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. Leaving only the darkness behind, she stood in the clearing, frozen. The cold air bit at her skin. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her eyes darted around, searching the shadows. But the forest was empty. The figure, the thing that had looked like Emily, was gone. Only the sound of her own heartbeat filled the silence. She turned back toward the cabin, heart pounding. The path seemed longer now, twisted. Her footsteps were heavy, echoing in the stillness. The house, once comforting, now felt like a trap. She stumbled back inside, slamming the door behind her. The living room was empty, too quiet. The fire had gone out, leaving nothing but smoldering embers. She called out, her voice hoarse. "Jake? Emily?" But there was no reply. The house seemed to close in, its walls pressing in tighter. She felt the coldness seep into her bones. The shadows moved. No, she told herself, it was just her mind playing tricks. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She grabbed the flashlight from the table. Her hands were shaking as she flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness. She scanned the room. Nothing. She moved toward the stairs again, dread building in her chest. This time, her footsteps were louder, almost frantic. Up she went. The hallway stretched out before her, each step seeming more drawn out than the last. The door at the end of the hall was ajar again. She could feel her pulse quicken. With each step, the air grew thicker. She pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the necklace was gone. Her stomach churned. The silence was suffocating. Asterisk, please. Help me. Asterisk. Her chest tightened as if the forest itself was squeezing the breath from her. She could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching her. Suddenly, a sharp pain stabbed through her chest. A cold, icy feeling that spread through her body. She gasped, her hands instinctively clutching at the ground beneath her. The pain intensified, radiating outward from her heart. "They're coming." The voice echoed again, clearer this time, the words crawling into her mind like venom. Her limbs began to tremble uncontrollably. Her fingers dug into the soil, desperately searching for something, anything to hold on to. And then, in the corner of her vision, something moved. A figure, a shadow. It was hard to focus, the darkness swirling in front of her. But she knew. It was them. Her daughter. Her son. They were standing there, just out of reach. But their faces, their eyes were hollow, empty. Their mouths opened, but no sound came out. And yet, the words filled her mind, clear as day. "Join us." Her body shook with a cold terror that reached deep into her bones. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure stepped closer, their movements slow, deliberate. The space between them and her grew smaller. She felt their presence cold, suffocating, pressing against her chest. "We are waiting." The voices in her head were no longer separate. They were one, a collective, unified whisper, rising louder, more insistent. "You belong with us." Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. Her head spun. There was nothing she could do, nowhere to run. The cold spread, filling her veins, turning her body to ice. We are waiting. The figures grew clearer, their shapes taking form in the darkness. Her children, twisted and hollow, staring at her with those empty eyes. They reached for her. She could feel their hands, cold as death, brushing against her skin. And then everything went black. The whispers faded into the void. The forest was still, and there was nothing left. The blackness was absolute. A suffocating void where time had no meaning. It felt as if she was floating in a place where nothing existed but her. Her senses were numb. There was no air, no sound, no feeling. Just emptiness. But then a flicker. A whisper in the dark. Wake up. The voice was soft, distant, almost familiar. Her body trembled. Asterisk no. Please, not again, asterisk. She fought against the crushing void, her hands reaching out into the darkness. But it was so heavy, so thick. Another whisper. Wake up before it's too late. Her mind screamed. She fought harder. Then a sharp, stabbing pain in her chest. She gasped. Air rushed back into her lungs. Cold, ragged breaths. The pain was overwhelming. She coughed, desperate for air. Her vision blurred, but there was light. Faint at first, but growing stronger. It wasn't the suffocating darkness anymore. She was back. Somehow, she opened her eyes, blinking against the bright light. The ground beneath her was soft, wet. She was lying in the woods, the cold earth pressing against her back. The trees towered overhead, their twisted forms reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. Her head throbbed, and the air tasted thick, like smoke. She sat up, dizzy. Her body ached. Every inch of her felt like it had been crushed. But she was alive. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. But the sound of crackling leaves beneath someone's footsteps shattered that illusion. She turned quickly, heart racing. There, standing in the distance, was a figure. It was hard to make out, but it looked like a person. Her blood ran cold. It was them, Emily, Jake. But they weren't moving. They were just standing there, their eyes locked on her. Empty, hollow, their faces pale and lifeless. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to stand. She needed to run, needed to get away, but her body wouldn't move. The air felt thick again, suffocating. The whisper returned, low and rasping. Join us. The words echoed louder this time. She could feel them crawling into her mind. The figures began to step forward, their movements slow but deliberate. The ground beneath her felt unstable, shifting. Her body refused to move. The whisper grew louder, closer. We are waiting. It was no longer just the children's voices. There were others now. More voices, more whispering, chanting. The forest seemed to pulse, the trees swaying unnaturally. And then, as if the world itself had given way, the ground cracked open before her. A dark void, blacker than the night, yawned wide. From the depths of the hole, figures began to emerge. They were not human. Twisted shapes, shadows that took form only to shift back into darkness. Her chest tightened, a scream rising in her throat. But no sound came. The void was pulling her in. The forest, the house, everything, it was all a lie. Her mind screamed for escape, but there was no escape. Only the whispers, the shadows, and the cold. The cold that was now closing in. As the darkness swallowed her whole, she could hear one last thing. A voice. Clear. Help me. And then silence. The silence was unbearable. A void that stretched on, endless. She couldn't see, couldn't feel, couldn't move. Only the cold. The biting cold that wrapped itself around her, pulling her deeper into the emptiness. And then, out of the blackness, a shape formed. A shadow that took form, growing more solid with each passing second. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and thin like branches from a dead tree. The figure stood before her, its face hidden in darkness, but she could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, boring into her. The air around her seemed to freeze, her body locked in place, unable to scream, unable to flee. The figure raised its hand, its fingers elongated and jagged, as if they had been shaped from the very shadows themselves. It reached for her. The whisper returned, louder now, almost deafening. "You cannot escape." The words slid into her mind like poison. A sharp pain shot through her chest, followed by an unbearable pressure in her head. Her vision swam, the world around her distorting and warping, as if it was crumbling away. The figure stepped closer, its shadow stretching out, swallowing the last traces of light. Its breath, cold as death, brushed across her face. And then, in a voice that wasn't its own, it spoke. "Join us." The words were like a chant, a dark rhythm that pulsed through her skull. "Join us." She could feel herself being pulled in, dragged toward the figure. The shadows were alive, wrapping themselves around her, squeezing tighter with every passing second. She gasped, her heart pounding, desperate for release. But there was none. The darkness was consuming her, filling every inch of her being, until she couldn't tell where she ended and it began. And then a voice. It was familiar but distant, calling her name. "Mom." Her heart skipped a beat. "Emily?" "Mom, help me." The voice was clearer now, more desperate. She reached out, her hands trembling in the void. "Emily," she whispered, though her voice barely made a sound. But there was no answer. Only the shadows, only the cold. "Join us." The whisper twisted, melding with the voice of her daughter. She couldn't breathe. Her chest tightened. Something in her snapped. She fought, struggled, her will thrashing against the suffocating grip of the darkness. And then, with a sudden surge of strength, she jerked her hand forward. Her fingers brushed something soft. A necklace. Emily's necklace. She gripped it with all her might. The shadows recoiled. The dark figure paused. For a moment, everything was still. And then, with a deafening roar, the shadows retreated. The figure wavered, flickering like a dying flame, and then it was gone. The blackness began to lift, fading into the distance. She blinked, disoriented, gasping for air. Her body, weak and trembling, felt heavy with exhaustion. But the darkness, the suffocating cold was gone. She looked around, unsure of where she was. The forest. It was quiet now. The whispers had stopped, but everything felt wrong, empty. The trees, gnarled and twisted, loomed over her like silent sentinels. And in the distance, she could see it, the cabin. Her heart leapt in her chest. She had to get there. She had to find her family. But as she stumbled forward, a feeling of dread washed over her once more. The wind had died down, but the air still felt heavy. She could almost hear the faintest whisper in the distance. A voice, her daughter's voice. "Help me again." She froze. The whisper seemed to echo from everywhere, as if the very trees were speaking it. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. But the fear remained. It was all wrong. The house, the woods, her family. The forest was alive, watching her. And she could feel it now. The shadows hadn't gone. They were waiting. Waiting for her to return. Waiting for her to stay. She stumbled forward, her heart hammering in her chest. The cabin stood ahead, dark and foreboding against the pale sky. It didn't look like the same cabin she had seen earlier, not anymore. The windows were covered in a heavy layer of grime, the door slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. Her feet dragged with each step, as though something unseen was pulling at her heels, urging her to stop. But she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when she had come so far. Her mind raced. Memories of the forest, the shadows, the voices. Help me. The words replayed in her head over and over. Her daughter, her son. Where were they? Were they even real? Her body felt heavy, the exhaustion overwhelming, but she pushed on, every step a struggle. Finally, she reached the door. It stood open, like an invitation or a trap. With a deep breath, she pushed it wide. The door groaned as it opened fully, the room inside dim and still. The house was cold, unnervingly cold. The fireplace, once a warm refuge, was empty, its ashes long extinguished. The walls were draped in shadow, corners darkened by the faint light that filtered through the cracked windows. It felt wrong, so wrong. She called out, her voice trembling. Emily? Jake? Nothing. Silence. Her breath hitched in her throat. She stepped further into the room, the creaking floorboards beneath her, making her skin crawl. The house felt like it was alive, breathing, watching her. The faint sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, echoed from upstairs. Her heart skipped. She wasn't alone. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Someone was moving above her. Her children? No. The footsteps didn't sound right. They were too slow, too deliberate, like they were dragging their feet. A cold dread settled in her stomach. The air grew thicker with every passing second, the darkness pressing in from every corner. She had to get upstairs. She had to find them. With her heart pounding in her ears, she ascended the stairs, each step creaking beneath her weight. At the top, the hallway stretched out before her, long and empty, the doors closed as they had been before. But there was one door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. She reached for it, her hand shaking as she pushed it open. Inside, the room was bare, save for a small wooden chest sitting in the center of the floor. Her breath caught in her throat. The chest. Her mind raced. The necklace. Emily's necklace. She had seen it, hadn't she? Back in the woods. Her fingers trembled as she walked toward the chest. She reached down, pulling the lid open. Inside, the necklace was resting on top, glimmering faintly in the dim light. But it wasn't just the necklace. There's something else. A piece of paper folded and stained with dark ink. Her hands moved of their own accord as she unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the words. Asterisk, don't trust them. They will take everything. Asterisk. The words were scrawled in a frantic hand, smeared in places, as if written in haste. Her breath caught in her throat. She had no time to think, no time to process what it meant. A sound behind her. She froze. A low, raspy whisper. Help me. The voice. It was Emily's voice. The temperature in the room dropped, the air thickening around her. Her skin crawled, her body trembling with a fear she couldn't control. She turned slowly. At the edge of the doorway stood a figure, its face obscured by shadows. But she knew. She knew who it was. Her daughter. But her eyes, those hollow eyes, stared back at her, empty and unblinking. Her lips parted again, the whisper growing louder. Help me. Please. The words were like a poison, twisting in her mind. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural. Her heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't her daughter. This was something else. The shadows seemed to move with the figure, twisting and warping like a living thing. The room was closing in. She couldn't breathe. The figure raised its hand, a dark, gnarled shape, reaching toward her. And then, just as it was about to touch her, the door behind her slammed shut. The room went pitch black. Her pulse thundered in her ears, panic rising in her throat. The whispers grew louder, closer. Asterisk, join us. We are waiting, asterisk. The darkness closed in around her. She couldn't escape. There was no way out. The shadows had already claimed her, the darkness swallowed her whole, the cold tightening its grip around her chest. She tried to scream, but no sound left her lips. The air was thick, suffocating, and she felt herself sinking deeper into it. The floor beneath her feet began to shift, warping like the earth itself was alive, stretching and cracking. The whispers, no, the voices swirled around her, coming from all directions. Their words mixed into a maddening chorus, a cacophony of distorted cries and pleas. Help me. Join us. Don't leave. Her heart raced in her chest, pounding so loudly that it drowned out everything else. She could feel their presence, every shadow, every shape in the room closing in on her. They're here. They're everywhere. A figure materialized in front of her. No, not a figure. A shape, shifting and flickering. A mass of darkness that resembled a person, but was not. Its outline wavered in the oppressive air. And then, in that same distorted, echoing voice, it spoke. Help us, help me. She froze, every muscle in her body screaming to run, to get away. But her feet wouldn't move. Her eyes locked onto the shape. It was familiar. Her daughter's face, but twisted, deformed. The eyes were empty sockets, dark and endless. Her daughter's mouth moved, but it wasn't her voice anymore. It was a hollow, gurgling whisper, pleading for her to come closer. Join us. We can be together again. We can be whole. The room spun around her, the shadows closing in, her thoughts scattered. Was this real? Was her daughter, her son here? Or was this a nightmare that wouldn't let go? The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to press inward, suffocating her. But then, through the overwhelming darkness, she felt a tug, a pull at her heart, a whisper in her mind. It was Emily's voice again, weak, desperate. Mom. Her stomach twisted. Emily? Her hands trembled as she reached out, but the figure before her grew larger, the shadows stretching out like claws. No, she whispered hoarsely. This isn't real. But it was real. The shadows closed in tighter, their cold fingers brushing her skin. And then she heard it, a sound, faint at first, but growing louder, a door creaking, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. Her heart raced as she turned, a shadow unmistakable now, tall, thin, familiar. Jake, her son, but his eyes were hollow too, his body limp, like a puppet with its strings cut. Jake, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. What happened to you? The figure stood still, silent, staring at her with those empty eyes. But then a flicker, a brief moment of clarity in his gaze. And then it was gone. The shadows moved again, this time faster, crawling up her legs, wrapping around her arms. She struggled against them, but they tightened their grip. Her vision blurred. Help me. It was Emily's voice again, faint, but clear. She was being pulled into the darkness, into the cold. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She needed to move, needed to escape. But everything was slowing down. The walls of the room pressed closer, the floor cracking beneath her. Then, just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, she saw a flash of light, a single, bright beam cutting through the shadows. It was a sliver of hope. She reached for it, desperate. The light grew brighter, and she saw it clearly now, a figure, standing in the doorway. A silhouette, not the shadow of a monster, but her, Emily, her daughter, standing there with her arms outstretched, her eyes full of fear, but still alive. Mom, you have to come now. They're trying to keep you here. She could barely make out the words, her vision spinning. But her daughter was real. Emily was real. She was reaching out, her hand glowing with an ethereal light. The shadows screeched in agony, their grip weakening. With a final burst of strength, she pushed through the darkness, tearing herself away from their cold, suffocating hold. Her daughter's hand was so close, so close. And then, with everything she had left, she reached out. Her fingers brushed against Emily's. The shadows screamed, the darkness around her shuddering. And then, everything went still. The room was silent. She opened her eyes. The shadows were gone. The cold had lifted. Her daughter stood before her, smiling weakly, her eyes clear once more. They were back in the woods, the cabin far behind them. But there was still something uneasy in the air, something that wasn't quite right. A whisper in the wind. Asterisk, we'll be waiting. Asterisk. She turned, and in the distance, the trees seemed to sway, as if something unseen was watching. It was not over. Not yet. But for now, they were free. The air still felt thick, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. She looked at Emily, her heart pounding in her chest. Her daughter's face was pale, but her eyes, they were different, alive. No longer empty, but the forest, it felt wrong. The trees loomed overhead, their gnarled branches twisting unnaturally in the fading light. She could still hear it, that faint whispering. It was like a distant murmur, so soft it could have been the wind, if the wind didn't feel so cold, so hollow. "We need to go," Emily said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper, though her grip tightened on her mother's hand. "We can't stay here. Where's Jake?" Her voice trembled as she spoke his name. Emily's face faltered for a moment, and her eyes flickered with a haunting fear. He didn't make it. Her heart dropped. A cold ache spread through her chest as she looked around, as if expecting to see her son standing there, calling to her. But there was nothing. No sign of him. "How do we leave?" she asked, trying to steady her breath. Emily shook her head, her expression darkening. "It's not that easy, Mom. They won't let us go. Not for good." The whispering grew louder, more urgent, curling around them like tendrils of smoke. "Don't listen to them." Emily's voice was sharp now, commanding, as if she were trying to break free of something. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, the earth itself groaning, as if reacting to the rising voices. "They're coming." The words were clear now, cutting through the fog in her mind. "Asterisk, you can't leave. You belong to us, asterisk." The forest shook. The trees trembled, their twisted forms bending, like they were reaching for them. "Run," Emily shouted, pulling her mother forward. They ran, stumbling through the thickening woods, but the path seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees closing in around them. The whispering was everywhere. In the trees, in the air. They were following them. Her heart raced, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The woods felt endless. "They're not real," she told herself. "This isn't real." But as she looked around, she could see the figures starting to emerge, dark shapes, indistinct at first, but then clearer. Figures with hollow eyes, twisted, skeletal shapes that crawled from the shadows, their movements jerky and unnatural. "They're here." Emily tugged at her arm. "Keep running, Mom. They can't reach us if we keep moving." But the figures kept coming, closer, faster. The air grew colder, a biting chill seeping into her bones. And then the ground beneath her feet crumbled. She felt herself falling, her arms flailing as she was pulled into a deep, dark pit, a gaping hole that opened up from nowhere. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. She felt the wind whip around her, the ground disappearing beneath her. Her body twisted, falling, spinning into nothing. Her heart stopped. And then, in the pitch black, a voice, a familiar, terrifying voice. "Help me, Mom." It was Jake. She gasped, her eyes wide open, but all she saw was darkness. The shadows reached out for her, cold hands wrapping around her, pulling her deeper. "Mom." Jake's voice echoed again, this time full of despair, but she couldn't see him, couldn't reach him. And then, as if the pit had no bottom, the darkness rushed in faster. drowning everything. Her chest tightened, but she was sinking into the cold, into the unknown. There was no way out. The whispers continued, their voices becoming clearer, louder. Join us, forever, together. And then, just as the shadows closed in, everything stopped. The silence was deafening. Her heart hammered in her chest as she opened her eyes. But this time, it wasn't the pit. It wasn't the forest. She was back in the cabin. The walls were still untouched. But there was something different now, something ominous. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed a figure standing in the doorway. It was Jake. His eyes were empty, his body stiff, just like the others she had seen. But this time, he was holding something. A small, twisted necklace. Emily's necklace. Her stomach twisted. The world around her began to distort, the edges darkening. And then, in the dim light, she heard a soft, hollow whisper. We are waiting. The room began to close in around her. And the last thing she saw before everything went dark was Jake's hollow, lifeless eyes. The darkness claimed her once more. And there was no escape. The darkness stretched out, a suffocating silence surrounding her. She felt the weight of it, pressing down on her chest, making it impossible to breathe. Her body felt numb, as if she were floating in some twisted, inescapable dream. And yet there was something, a cold presence, lurking just beyond the edges of her perception. The whispers returned, soft at first, like a distant murmur, but growing louder with each passing second. We are waiting. Her heart thundered in her chest, pounding against the suffocating void. She opened her eyes, but there was no light, no shape, no form, just an endless stretch of black. She could still feel it, the weight of the air, thick and heavy. A sudden rush of icy cold seeped through her skin, wrapping around her bones like ice. And then, out of the blackness, a figure appeared. It was tall, impossibly tall, its shape bent and warped, as if made from the very shadows themselves. Its presence filled the space, looming over her, its face hidden in darkness. She could feel it watching her, its cold eyes burrowing into her soul. The whispers grew more frantic, swirling around her, pressing against her mind. You can escape. You belong here. Forever. Her pulse quickened, her hands trembling. She tried to move, but her limbs were frozen, heavy as stone. The figure took a step forward, its feet making no sound as it glided across the darkness. And then it spoke. Join us. The voice was not her own, but something much darker, cold, distant, and filled with ancient malice. Her throat tightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Join us. She could feel it in her chest now, that pull, that suffocating force urging her to give in. Her mind screamed at her to fight, to break free, but her body wouldn't respond. The shadows closed in tighter, curling around her, tightening with each passing moment. She felt herself being drawn closer to the figure, unable to resist, unable to escape. But then, a flash of light, a distant, faint glimmer, like a dying star. A figure, someone she knew. Emily, Mom. Her daughter's voice pierced through the dark, sharp and clear. Mom, you have to wake up. With every ounce of strength she had left, she pushed against the shadows, her hands breaking free from the grip of the darkness. She reached for the light, for Emily, but it flickered and vanished. The shadows were closing in again, pulling her deeper. No, she screamed. Please, no. The figure loomed closer, its hand outstretched, cold and lifeless. But just as it touched her, everything shattered. The darkness splintered like glass, cracking and falling away. The shadows screamed, recoiling, as if the very light itself was burning them. She gasped for air, lungs aching, and the world around her shifted. It was bright now, the cabin. The room was no longer dark and oppressive, but there was something wrong. She wasn't alone. Emily stood in front of her, but her face, her eyes, they were hollow, empty. The twisted form of her daughter reached out, its hands like claws, her voice a hollow echo. "Help me, Mom, come back." The light flickered, her vision blurred. She turned. Jake stood there too, his body bent at an unnatural angle, his hollow eyes staring directly into her soul. The world was spinning. The house was warping. Everything around her was fading, crumbling, like dust in the wind. She tried to move, to escape, but the walls around her closed in, faster and faster, the space narrowing. She was suffocating. The darkness began to return, faster this time. Her heart raced, the whispers louder, more urgent. "Join us." It was everywhere. The whispers, the shadows, the figures. "Join us forever." Her mind screamed for release, for anything but this. And then the floor gave way. She was falling into the endless void once more. Her body twisted, her vision spinning. The whispers grew louder, sharper. "You belong to us." And then, just before she was swallowed whole by the void, she saw it. A bright flash of light, a figure. Emily, or what used to be Emily, standing in the distance, her face twisted into a smile. But her eyes were hollow, and they were waiting for her to join them. Forever the light flickered once more, a brief, desperate pulse that illuminated the emptiness around her. For a moment, it felt like she was suspended in time, caught between two worlds. The shadows around her seemed to breathe, drawing in the light, suffocating it. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. The whispers had grown frantic, almost screaming now, as if the very air around her was filled with their hunger. "Join us." The voice of Emily echoed, haunting, distant, but somehow close, as though she was right there in the darkness, just beyond reach. Her body trembled, the cold seeping deeper into her bones, but still her hands clung to the memory of warmth, of light, of her family. But everything was fading. The darkness was all-encompassing, its grip suffocating, pulling her in with every second. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she tried to move, but her limbs felt like stone, heavy and unyielding. Her fingers twitched, struggling to grasp at something, anything, to break free from the hold of the void. And then, through the overwhelming darkness, she saw it. A glimmer, a soft light. It wasn't just a flash this time. It was steady, constant, and it was coming from ahead, from the direction where Emily's twisted figure had been. But now it wasn't Emily. A shape stood in the light, tall, familiar, yet distant. Her heart skipped a beat. Jake, his eyes, once hollow, now filled with a warmth that pierced through the darkness. He stood there, bathed in a soft, golden glow, reaching out toward her. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking through the whispers, gentle and real. "Come to me. It's not too late." The light around him grew brighter, pushing back the shadows, pushing back the whispers. Her pulse quickened. Asterisk, this is real. This is my son, asterisk. She took a step forward, then another, her legs shaking as she moved, her body still stiff with the weight of the dark. "Jake!" Her voice was barely more than a whisper, trembling, but it was enough. "I'm coming. I'm coming to you." The light beckoned her, stronger now, a force that promised escape, freedom. She took another step, then another, as the shadows recoiled, retreating into the edges of her vision. And then, just as she thought she might be free, just as the light wrapped around her like a comforting embrace, the ground beneath her feet cracked. The floor split wide open, the light shattering, breaking like glass. Jake's figure flickered and twisted. His once warm eyes turned cold, his smile turning into something else, something sinister. "Mom," he whispered, his voice now warped. It's too late. The light faded, replaced by the hollow presence of the shadows, closing in again, faster this time. Their cold fingers brushed against her skin. The last thing she saw was his face, his eyes empty again, like the others. Join us. The ground continued to break away beneath her, falling deeper into the blackness, swallowing her whole. No more light, no more escape. The shadows had claimed her, and this time they wouldn't let her go. The darkness closed in tighter, suffocating, pulling at her with an unrelenting force. Her breath caught in her throat as she plunged deeper into the abyss, the whispering voices growing louder, merging into a singular, horrific chant. Join us. She could feel the cold, the emptiness seeping into her very being, wrapping itself around her heart, dragging her under. But in the midst of the suffocating silence, she heard something else. A voice, a faint, weak cry. Mom. It was Emily. Her heart skipped. Her daughter's voice. But it was distant, fragile, like a whisper on the edge of her mind. The shadows didn't want her to hear it. They pressed against her, forcing the voice to fade, to slip away. She fought against it, clawing at the darkness with everything she had left. Asterisk, no. I won't lose you. I won't lose both of you, asterisk. But the abyss was closing in, pulling her into its depths. The voices had become deafening now, their words like claws scraping against her soul. She had to make a choice. She had to find the strength to break free. Her body shook, the coldness crawling beneath her skin. But there was still something, someone out there. Her mind screamed, willing her to reach for that voice. Emily, her fingers twitched. She reached out into the blackness, desperate, fighting the pull of the shadows. And then, just as the darkness seemed ready to consume her, a small light flickered in the distance. It was faint but unmistakable. Her heartbeat quickened. The light. Emily's light. She stretched out her hand, every muscle in her body screaming with the effort to move toward it. She could hear Emily's voice again, clearer this time. Mom, please don't leave me. Her fingers brushed against the light. A warmth spread through her hand, and for a moment, the darkness faltered. The shadows recoiled. The pull of the void weakened. But just as quickly, the light flickered again, and the pull of the shadows strengthened. She screamed out, feeling herself slipping, her body breaking apart as the darkness tore at her. Asterisk, don't let them win. Please, Mom, asterisk. Emily's voice was no longer a whisper. It was full of fear, full of pain. The light flickered once more, its glow dimming, threatening to fade completely. But something in her, something deep inside, refused to let go. With a final, desperate surge, she pushed through, reaching with all her might toward the light. Emily, her fingers closed around the warmth, and suddenly, everything went white. A blinding flash, a rush of warmth, and then silence. She opened her eyes. The forest. The cabin was gone. The shadows, the whispers, the dark presence. It was all gone. Emily stood before her, her face tear-streaked but whole, her eyes clear, alive. Emily? Mom, you're back, Emily whispered, her voice a mixture of relief and joy. Her heart fluttered. She could feel the warmth of the light around them now. The weight of the darkness had lifted, but there was still a shadow lingering, a sense of something unfinished. The air still held a trace of coldness. Are we safe? She asked, her voice trembling. Emily nodded slowly, but there was something in her expression, a hint of uncertainty. The ground beneath them began to tremble. A low hum filled the air. The darkness wasn't completely gone. Not yet. We are waiting. The whisper was faint, but it was there. It was always there. The forest, the ground, even the air seemed to pulse with an ominous energy. But this time, Emily's hand gripped hers, and the warmth between them pushed back against the chill. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a flicker of hope, but the shadows were still waiting. And the journey was far from over. The ground trembled beneath them, the air growing colder again, as though something unseen was watching, waiting. Emily's grip tightened around her hand, her face filled with both determination and fear. "It's not over, is it?" her mother whispered, dread creeping into her chest. She could feel the presence lingering, the weight of the forest pressing in from all sides. Emily shook her head, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and resolve. "No, Mom, it's not. They're still here. But we can't let them take us again." The ground continued to rumble, the trees swaying unnaturally, as if disturbed by an invisible force. The whispers, soft at first, began to swell, echoing through the woods like 1,000 voices chanting in unison. "Join us forever." She turned, ready to leave the room, but something caught her eye. The wall, there, scrawled in what looked like dirt. A message. "Don't look behind you." Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she turned. The flashlight beam shook. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, tall, shadowed, its face obscured by darkness. She could feel its eyes on her, cold and empty. The air grew even colder, biting her skin. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, waiting. A cold whisper filled her ears. "Help me." Her heart raced. This wasn't real. She backed away, her mind scrambling, but her feet couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, unable to tear her eyes away from the figure. Then the silence shattered. A loud bang echoed through the house. The figure lunged. The flashlight dropped from her hand. She ran down the stairs, the door. She needed to get outside. She threw herself at the door, her hands fumbling with the handle. The cold, hollow laugh echoed behind her. It wasn't human. It was something else. She forced the door open and ran into the night. The forest swallowed her whole. Branches whipped at her face. The cold air burned her lungs. Her eyes searched the darkness. But the forest was silent. Too silent. And then she heard it. The whisper again. "Help me." But this time it was coming from all around her. She turned, her breath ragged. There, standing in the shadows between the trees, were two figures. One was Emily, her eyes wide, lifeless. The other was Jake, the same vacant expression. "Help us," they whispered in unison. Her heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The shadows closed in around her, and then, all at once, the whispering stopped. The forest held its breath, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the figures were gone. The woods fell silent. Everything was still, except for the soft thumping of her heart in her ears. The whispers were gone, but she knew one thing. She was not alone. Something was watching, waiting. Her breath hitched as the silence pressed in. She spun around, eyes darting through the shadows. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves felt like it was closing in on her. The forest was alive with an unsettling stillness. Then, from behind her, came a soft, guttural sound, a slow scrape against the earth, like something dragging its feet. Her body froze. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The sound grew louder, closer. A cold gust of wind rushed past her, making her skin crawl. And then, from the darkness, it appeared. A figure, tall, skeletal, and wrapped in tattered, shadowy robes. Its eyes glowed an unnatural, pale blue. The world seemed to tilt as it stepped toward her, its movements slow, deliberate. A sickening chill washed over her. The figure raised its hand long, twisted fingers stretching out toward her. She gasped, stumbling back. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she fought to move, but her feet were frozen to the earth. The figure's lips parted, but no sound came at first. And then, In a voice that was not its own, it spoke. "Help me. You can't leave." The voice echoed, distorted, like 1,000 whispers combined. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her vision blurred as she tried to back away. But the figure advanced, each step deliberate, each movement too slow, too sure. "Help me, or you'll never leave." Her throat tightened. Her instinct screamed at her to flee, to run, but she couldn't. The figure leaned in closer, its breath cold against her skin. "Your family, your daughter. They belong here now." Her knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, gasping for air. The figure's eyes locked onto hers, empty and dark, as if staring into her very soul. A soft whisper crawled through her mind, not a sound, but a thought. "You can't escape." And then, as if the forest itself had turned against her, the ground beneath her feet gave way. A sharp pull at her legs, like something unseen had wrapped its icy fingers around her ankles. Her body jerked downward, and she screamed as her fingers clawed at the earth. But it was no use. She was being dragged deeper into the earth. The figure above her watched, its hollow gaze never leaving her face. "Help me," it whispered again. Her screams were drowned out as the forest closed in, the trees seeming to bow toward her, as though they were listening. And then there was nothing. The whispering stopped. The air grew still again. The figure was gone. The forest was silent. All that remained was the cold and the emptiness. The darkness took her when the silence returned. It was suffocating. The ground had swallowed her whole. Her body was suspended, tangled in the cold, damp soil. She struggled to breathe, her chest tight, her limbs weak. The air was thick with decay, musty and suffocating. Her heart raced in the stillness, her mind a blur. Where was she? How had she ended up here? The world above felt distant, unreachable. But then she felt it, a presence, cold fingers brushing against her skin, slowly, deliberately. She opened her eyes, but all she saw was darkness. The world felt endless, like an abyss that stretched forever. The whispers returned, but they weren't coming from around her. They were inside her mind. "Help me." Her breath hitched. "We can't leave." She fought to pull herself free, but the earth held her tight. The shadows seemed to pulse around her, alive. Her pulse was deafening in her ears. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. Her mother's breath hitched, the words cutting through her like a blade. The shadows seemed to grow longer, more distinct now, creeping along the edges of the trees, stretching toward them with an almost tangible hunger. Emily's voice trembled, but she stood firm. "They want us to give in, to let them take us. But we have to fight, together. We can't go back." Her mother nodded, though her heart pounded with fear. The cabin was nowhere to be seen now. The forest had swallowed it whole. All that remained was the oppressive weight of the dark, the endless echo of those cursed whispers. They started walking, slowly at first, unsure of where to go or what to do. The woods seemed endless, each step feeling like a mile as the air grew heavier, colder. But the deeper they moved, the more the trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled branches reaching down like twisted hands. The ground beneath their feet shifted with each step, as if the earth itself was alive, twisting, pulling them into the depths. Emily stopped suddenly, pulling her mother to a halt. "Listen," she whispered urgently. The air was thick, a low hum reverberating through the ground. The whispers had stopped for a moment, and in the eerie silence, something else began to rise. A sound slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. Footsteps. Heavy, uneven footsteps, dragging across the dirt. Her mother's breath caught in her throat as she turned, scanning the darkness. She could barely make out the silhouette of a figure moving toward them through the trees. It was tall, its shape almost indistinct in the shadows, but there was no mistaking the cold, hollow presence that surrounded it. And then she heard it, A voice. Asterisk, we are waiting. Asterisk. It was Jake. His voice, distorted and hollow, but unmistakable. Her heart stopped. No, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. No, Jake. The figure moved closer, stepping into the dim light of the clearing. It was Jake, or something that looked like him. His body was gaunt, his eyes empty and black, his face twisted in an unnatural expression. Jake! Emily's voice cracked. No, this isn't you. But the figure, Jake, didn't respond. It only tilted its head, its eyes hollow pits that seemed to consume everything in their gaze. Its mouth stretched into a wide, grotesque grin. Asterisk, join us. Asterisk, it whispered again, its voice rising in a cacophony with the others that now filled the air. The shadows around them thickened, swirling and pulsating as if alive, feeding on their fear. The ground beneath them seemed to pulse with an unearthly rhythm, an unsettling beat that shook the very core of the forest. We can't stay here, Mom, Emily cried, grabbing her hand, pulling her away from the figure. It's not him. It's never been him. Her mother's legs felt like lead, her body unwilling to move, rooted to the spot by the terror that had gripped her heart. Jake's distorted form stepped forward, its smile widening, the shadows swirling faster around them. Asterisk, join us forever. Asterisk. The words became a maddening chorus, the voices all around them, pressing against their minds, suffocating them. Her mother's chest tightened, her vision starting to blur. She could feel the darkness trying to pull her under, the pull of the shadows stronger than ever before. She felt herself losing control, felt herself slipping away. But then Emily's voice broke through. Mom, Emily screamed, her voice desperate. Don't listen to them. You have to fight. We can escape. Her mother's head swam, but Emily's words pierced through the haze. She looked at her daughter, real, alive, and found the strength to push back against the darkness, to push against the pull of the shadows. Not yet. Come on, Mom. Emily pulled her forward, her voice full of resolve. We fight this together. We can still make it out. With a final surge of strength, her mother took a step forward and then another. She grabbed Emily's hand, clutching it tightly as they ran through the trees, the shadows following close behind. The darkness seemed to claw at them, but with every step, the light grew brighter, the shadows weaker. But just as they thought they might escape, a sharp pain shot through her chest. She gasped, her legs buckling, and she looked down to see the shadows' claw-like fingers sinking into her skin. Her vision blurred, and she heard Emily's cry. But everything was slipping away again. Join us. But this time, she wasn't alone. Emily was still with her. They wouldn't give up. Not yet. Not ever. The darkness roared. But so did they. The shadows clawed at her, cold tendrils wrapping around her, pulling her into their grasp. Her heart raced, her breath shallow, the world around her spinning in a chaotic blur. But Emily's hand was still in hers, strong, unyielding. Mom, stay with me. Emily's voice was fierce, desperate, as she pulled her forward, away from the dark grasp. She fought against the cold that seeped deeper into her veins. Each step felt like moving through thick, heavy mud. Her body screamed in protest, her legs weak, but Emily's grip anchored her. Please, Mom, you have to fight. We can't let them win. Her mother's eyes flickered, her vision hazy. The whispers, the voices of the shadows, were growing louder, drowning out Emily's words, but she couldn't. Asterisk wouldn't asterisk. Give in. Not now. Not when her daughter was still with her. They pushed forward, through the thickening woods, the trees now twisting, their branches curling like claws overhead, as though the forest itself was trying to keep them in its dark embrace. The air was thick, suffocating. The farther they ran, the louder the whispers became, the heavier the air pressed down on them. But the light ahead was growing brighter now. They had to be close. She could almost taste it. Freedom, safety, the promise of escape. But then a sudden, sharp sound broke through the air. A crack, followed by the sickening groan of something heavy and unnatural. Her heart froze. The ground beneath them shifted violently, cracking open like the jaws of some terrible creature. The world seemed to tilt as the earth crumbled beneath their feet, a deep chasm opening wide in front of them. Her mother stumbled, falling forward, but Emily yanked her back just in time. "Mom," Emily cried, fear and urgency in her voice. "We can't stop now. We have to keep going." Her body trembled, but she forced herself to focus. The darkness was closing in on them faster now. The shadow of the figure, Jake Asterisk, or what had once been Jake, was moving toward them, its hollow eyes locked onto them. "Join us forever." The ground shook again, and with a deafening crash, the chasm grew wider, the forest shifting into something grotesque, twisted. The trees bent, the shadows slithered, and the air became thick with dread. But Emily pulled her forward. "We can do this. We can escape this, together." They were so close to freedom. Her heart pounded in her chest as they ran, faster now, with every ounce of strength left in her body. But as they neared the edge of the forest, the shadows surged forward, surrounding them, blocking their escape. The whispers became a chorus, loud and unyielding. "You cannot escape." Her heart sank. They were trapped. The ground beneath them trembled once more, and then everything stopped. Silence. The air grew still, and for a moment it was as though time itself had frozen. Her mother looked at Emily, her breath ragged, her mind racing. "Mom, we have to let them go. We have to leave them behind," Emily whispered, her voice shaking with the weight of her words. "It's the only way." Her mother's eyes widened, the realization settling like cold stone in her chest. She had to make a choice. She had to choose between holding on to the past, the fragments of her family that had been twisted and stolen, or moving forward, letting go of the darkness that had claimed them. She closed her eyes, letting the tears fall freely. Emily was still with her. Emily was real. They were the only things that mattered now. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "We let them go." With that, she took Emily's hand, squeezing it tightly as they turned their backs on the shadowed figures that had once been her children. The whispers screamed. The shadows lunged. But they kept running. They had no choice now. And as they pushed through the thickening forest, the shadows receding behind them, she knew deep in her heart that they hadn't truly escaped. The darkness was always waiting, but as long as they had each other, they could still fight. And for the first time in what felt like forever, her breath came easier. She wasn't alone anymore. Together, they would find a way to break free. And this time, they wouldn't look back. The forest around them seemed to shift with each step, the trees bending, their gnarled branches creaking, but they didn't stop. The whispers, though quieter now, still echoed in the distance, following them like a persistent shadow, but they kept running, one foot in front of the other. Emily's hand was tight in hers, and every step they took together felt like a victory. The darkness behind them felt like it was pulling back, retreating just a little bit with every mile, every inch they gained. But it was still there, lurking, waiting for a moment of weakness, a slip-up. Her heart hammered in her chest as they ran. She could still feel the cold fingers of the shadows tugging at the edges of her mind, but she pushed it down, focusing only on Emily, on the warmth of her hand, on the strength of her resolve. Asterisk, we will make it out. We will asterisk. The forest seemed endless, the trees growing taller, the night air growing colder. But somewhere deep inside, there was still hope. They had come so far, fought through so much, and now they were almost free. They just had to keep going. And then ahead of them, she saw it. A break in the trees, a clearing, light. Her heart leaped in her chest. It wasn't much, but it was something. A sliver of promise. A way out. "Mom, look!" Emily cried, pointing ahead. She looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. Could it really be? A way out of this nightmare? Without saying another word, they pushed forward, faster now, desperate. The light grew brighter as they neared it, the shadows seeming to fall away as they stepped into the clearing. It was as if the darkness itself couldn't survive in the light. Her mother's breath came in ragged gasps, but she didn't care. They were almost there. They were almost safe. But then a low, bone-chilling growl echoed from the trees behind them. Her blood ran cold. The ground trembled again, harder this time. The trees shook as if some great weight was descending upon them, and the air grew thick, heavy with something far worse than the shadows they had just escaped. Her mother's heart sank. She looked at Emily, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. They weren't alone. From the darkened trees, something emerged. Something massive, towering over them. A shadow, but not just any shadow. It was a shape, alive, breathing, moving with purpose. It stepped into the clearing, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Its eyes, cold, empty, and endless, locked onto them. The thing was not human. It was a creature of the dark, a twisted form that seemed to have been born from the very shadows themselves. Its limbs were long, its fingers clawed, its body wrapped in a shifting cloak of darkness that seemed to ripple and swirl. It moved slowly at first, but the air hummed with a dark energy as it drew closer, the ground beneath its feet withering, dying. Her mother felt her knees tremble, the fear threatening to overwhelm her. Emily squeezed her hand harder, but there was no way to outrun this thing. They had been running for so long, but now it had found them. "Asterisk, join us. Forever asterisk," the creature whispered in a voice that was not its own. It sounded like 1,000 voices layered on top of each other, each one more haunting than the last. Her mother's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. She could feel the darkness closing in around them again. She could feel it pulling at her very soul. But Emily's voice cut through the panic. "Asterisk, no!" "Asterisk," Emily shouted, her voice filled with the strength of someone who had been through too much to give in. "We won't join you. We won't." The creature paused, its hollow eyes narrowing, studying them. It seemed almost curious, as if it had never encountered resistance before. Her mother tightened her grip on Emily's hand, heart racing, as the creature took another step forward. And then something in her snapped. She didn't care about the darkness anymore. She didn't care about the creature or the shadows. All that mattered was Emily, her daughter. She would fight for her no matter what. With a sudden surge of energy, her mother pulled Emily behind her and stepped forward into the clearing, standing tall, her eyes filled with a quiet defiance. "We're not afraid of you," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "We won't let you take us." The creature's mouth curled into a twisted grin, as if amused by their defiance. But then something shifted. The light in the clearing, small as it was, began to grow. Slowly at first, like a candle catching wind, but then it flared, spreading outward, pushing back against the darkness that had surrounded them for so long. The creature hissed, its body recoiling as if the light burned it. "Join us, forever," it repeated, but its voice was faltering now, weaker. And that's when her mother knew. The light was their salvation, the one thing the creature feared. She turned to Emily, her voice fierce. "Stay close. Whatever happens, don't let go of my hand." They moved forward, together, step by step, and as they did, the light grew brighter, expanding faster, until it surrounded them completely, a bubble of warmth in the cold night. The creature screeched, its form writhing as if it were being burned alive, its shadowy body falling apart under the light's pressure. Asterisk, you can't escape us, asterisk, it hissed one last time, its voice fading as it disappeared into the darkness, retreating into the corners of the woods, where it could do no more harm. And then, just like that, the forest fell silent. Her mother's chest heaved, her heart still racing. But the danger was gone. The shadows had retreated, the whispers silenced. They were safe. For now. She looked down at Emily, her daughter's face glowing in the light, her eyes wide but filled with relief. They had made it. They had escaped. And this time, they were free. The silence of the clearing felt like a gift, a fragile peace after the storm of darkness they had endured. The light that enveloped them, warm and constant, was like a shield, pushing back the remnants of the night. But her heart still beat fast, the fear lingering in her chest like a shadow that wouldn't quite leave. Emily's hand was still tightly gripped in hers, but she could feel the weight of exhaustion in her daughter's fingers. The terror that had twisted them both was still there, gnawing at the edges of their minds. The darkness had tried to break them, and they had almost let it. But they were here now, together, and that had to be enough. Her mother took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing pulse. But even as the clearing remained quiet, the sense of something unfinished hovered in the air. The woods around them stretched far beyond the edge of the light, the darkness thick and deep, still watching, waiting. "Mom," Emily's voice was small, but it carried a weight that made her mother's heart tighten. "Is it really over? Is the darkness gone?" Her mother looked around, her eyes scanning the edge of the clearing, the trees standing tall and silent. The light around them was strong, but she knew the truth. The darkness was never truly gone. It had been defeated for now, but the woods, the shadows, they always came back. "I don't know," she said softly, her voice steady despite the gnawing uncertainty inside. "But we're safe here for now." Emily nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes, a question that hadn't been answered. She turned to her mother, her expression serious. "What happens if it comes back? What if it tries to take us again?" Her mother paused, her gaze flickering to the edge of the clearing. The warmth of the light was comforting, but she knew that the shadows had a way of creeping in, of finding the cracks in the world where light couldn't reach. "We won't let it," she said firmly. "We fight. We keep fighting together." Emily's eyes softened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled, a small, quiet smile that held more strength than anything her mother had ever seen. "Together," she echoed. The warmth of her daughter's words filled the space between them, a bond stronger than anything the darkness could throw at them. And as they stood there, surrounded by the fading echoes of their battle, the light began to flicker. Slowly at first, like a candle struggling against a gust of wind. Her heart skipped. But before she could react, Emily stepped forward, her hand outstretched. The light stabilized, growing brighter again with every breath Emily took. Together, her mother thought, her heart swelling with pride. This was their fight, and they would face whatever came next, side by side. Suddenly, the ground beneath them rumbled, and a distant sound broke the stillness, the hum of something deep within the forest. It wasn't the shadows this time. It was something else. Her mother turned sharply, her breath catching as a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. This time, it wasn't a creature of darkness, but a person. A man, tall, cloaked in a long, dark robe, his face obscured by shadows. He stepped forward with slow, deliberate movements, and she couldn't help but feel that this figure had been watching them for some time. "Who are you?" she demanded, stepping in front of Emily instinctively, the protective instinct rising within her. The man's voice was calm, almost soothing, but it carried a weight that sent a chill down her spine. "I am not here to harm you." "Then what do you want?" Her voice was sharp, demanding answers. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the folds of his cloak and withdrew something, a small object that shimmered in the light. It was a pendant, glowing faintly, its shape strange, almost ancient. "This," the man said, holding it out to her. "This is the key to keeping the darkness at bay. It will protect you, but only if you are ready to embrace it." Her heart pounded as she eyed the pendant. It was beautiful, almost mesmerizing, but there was something unsettling about it, something ancient, as though it carried the weight of forgotten ages, of power long buried beneath the earth. "And if we don't accept it?" Emily asked, her voice steady but cautious. The man's gaze flickered toward Emily, and for a brief moment his expression softened. "Then the darkness will return, and when it does, it will take you both." Her mother's heart clenched. "What do you mean, take us both?" The man took a step closer, his eyes gleaming beneath the hood of his cloak. "There are forces at work here, forces that you cannot yet understand, but you've felt them. The pull of the shadows, the weight of the unseen. You are both tied to this world, and this world is tied to you." The words didn't make sense. It was like a riddle, a puzzle that she couldn't piece together. But Emily took a small step forward, her eyes fixed on the pendant. "What happens if we take it? If we accept it?" The man smiled a thin, knowing smile. "You will gain the strength to keep the shadows away. You will fight on, protected from their reach." Her mother didn't trust him. Something about his presence, his calm demeanor, felt wrong. Yet the choice seemed clear. They couldn't go back. They couldn't return to the way things were. But as she reached out for the pendant, her fingers brushing its smooth surface, she felt a sudden wave of unease wash over her. The light flickered again, brighter now, blinding. The air grew heavier, charged with an energy that made her skin tingle. And for a brief moment, she wondered, had they really escaped? Or was the darkness only just beginning? The air seemed to pulse around them, charged with an unseen force. The pendant, now in her hand, was warm, almost too warm, as though it were alive with energy. Her fingers tingled as she held it, the sensation crawling up her arm, spreading through her chest, and into her very bones. But the unease never left. Her mother's heart beat louder in her ears, thudding as though warning her, as though she was on the edge of something far more dangerous than she realized. "What's happening?" Emily asked quietly, her voice trembling slightly as she took a step closer, her eyes locked onto the pendant. Her mother's gaze flickered between Emily and the figure in the shadows. The man still stood there, unmoving, his cloak billowing in an invisible wind. He was waiting, watching. It was then that she realized she couldn't trust him, not entirely. "Why did you give this to us?" her mother asked, her voice sharp. "What do you really want?" The man didn't flinch, his expression still hidden beneath his hood, but his eyes gleamed with a quiet intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I have no interest in you, child, not in the way you think. I am simply the messenger." "Messenger?" Emily repeated, her voice full of confusion. "For who?" The man tilted his head slightly, his lips curled into something like a smile, but it wasn't comforting. "For those who walk in the shadows, for those who remember." The words made no sense. Who remembers? Her mind spun as the pieces of the puzzle began to slip away from her grasp, like sand through her fingers. The pendant in her hand felt heavier now, its presence pressing against her palm like a weight she couldn't bear. "You are not alone in this," the man continued, stepping closer, his voice low, almost coaxing. "The shadows are part of you now, as much as you are part of them." Her heart clenched painfully. The words hung in the air like a dark omen, filling her chest with a deep, gnawing dread. She had felt it, hadn't she? The shadows reaching out to her, pulling at her soul, trying to drag her into their grasp. Emily reached out, her small hand trembling as she placed it gently on her mother's arm. "Mom, what do we do?" Her mother squeezed Emily's hand, trying to steady her own rising panic. Asterisk, what if the darkness never truly left? What if the shadows had only been waiting for this moment? Asterisk. The pendant, the man murmured, his eyes dark as night, will protect you. But you must choose to wield it. And once you do, you cannot return to the world you once knew. The balance will shift. You will become the guardians of the light and the shadows. But there is always a price. Her mother's throat went dry. She couldn't swallow. Price, she echoed, her voice hoarse, strained with the weight of fear. The man's smile widened. The darkness is ancient, child, and ancient things demand ancient sacrifices. Suddenly, a sharp, guttural noise sliced through the air, a screeching, unnatural sound that echoed through the trees, shaking the ground beneath them. The shadows at the edge of the clearing twitched, writhing, as if stirred by an unseen force. Her skin prickled, the hairs on her neck standing on end. Emily flinched, her hand clutching her mother's arm tighter. No. Her mother turned quickly, her eyes scanning the woods beyond the clearing. The air around them seemed to crackle with an invisible energy, and the whispers were louder now, swirling around her like a whirlwind. They were coming. The darkness is not gone. Mom, we need to leave, Emily whispered urgently, her voice barely a breath, her body shaking. Her mother clenched her jaw, holding the pendant tightly. She could feel its heat pulsing, the power within it now stirring like a storm ready to break. She couldn't explain why, but she knew that taking the pendant, embracing its power, might be their only way out. But at what cost? Mom, Emily said again, her voice more insistent now. We can't stay here. Not with that thing. Her mother looked at the man in the shadows, her chest tight with a sudden, rising panic. Why are you doing this to us? She demanded. I'm not doing anything, the man replied, his tone still calm, almost distant. The darkness was always here, always watching. I'm simply offering you a chance to choose. Embrace it, fight it, or be consumed by it. Her mind raced, each option a knife in her chest. To fight, to embrace the darkness, to let go. It all seemed like a trap. No matter which path she took, the shadows would be there, always lurking, always waiting. But then, a distant roar echoed through the trees. The ground shook again, harder this time. The trees cracked and bent, their branches twisting unnaturally. It was them, the creatures of the shadows. They were coming. Her eyes snapped back to the man, to the pendant in her hand. The light in the clearing flickered again, dimming. She had no choice. Emily, she said in a low, determined voice, take my hand. The man's lips parted slightly, as if expecting her to hesitate. But she didn't. Take it, she repeated, her voice firmer now. Emily didn't ask why. She didn't question. She simply did as her mother asked, her small hand slipping into her mother's, their fingers intertwined tightly. In that moment, the choice was clear. Her mother held the pendant high, and the moment it touched the air above them, the light exploded outward, a flash so bright that it blinded her for a heartbeat. The darkness hissed in pain, a screech that reverberated through her very bones. But it didn't stop. It was only the beginning. As the shadows surged forward, the battle for the light had only just begun. The light exploded outward in a blinding flash, more intense than anything she had ever felt. It surged through the clearing, wrapping around her and Emily like a protective cocoon. For a moment, everything was pure white, a searing, unrelenting brilliance that pushed the shadows back, forcing them to recoil. But as the light began to fade, the shadows didn't disappear. Instead, they surged forward again, stronger, more violent than before, as though they had been waiting for this moment. Her mother's heart pounded, the fear creeping back into her chest. The power from the pendant was still there, but it wasn't enough. She could feel the darkness wrapping around her, cold and suffocating, pulling at her mind, trying to invade her thoughts. It wanted to drag them back into the depths. Emily's grip tightened in her hand, her small fingers trembling with the weight of their situation. "Mom, what do we do now?" Emily whispered, her voice strained, fearful. Her mother's mind raced, the panic threatening to overwhelm her. The light had been strong, but it had not been enough. Not yet. And the creatures, the ones that had been stalking them through the forest, were drawing closer. She could feel their presence, no longer distant, but right at the edge of the clearing, watching, waiting to strike. The man, the one who had given her the pendant, was still there, his shadowy form now blending with the dark trees. His eyes gleamed in the dim light, his expression unreadable. "Do you see now?" he asked softly, almost pityingly. "The choice is never simple. The darkness always returns. The question is, how long will you fight it?" Her mother's chest tightened with the truth of his words. The darkness was always here, and it would always come back. She knew that now, just as she knew that the only way to protect Emily was to embrace what was within her. She looked down at the pendant in her hand once more. The warmth was still there, but it was fading, weakening. And then, with a sudden surge of resolve, she made the decision. "Emily," she said, her voice steady, her grip on her daughter's hand tightening. "We fight, and we never stop." She lifted the pendant once more, her heart steady now, her mind clear. She would not let the shadows win. Not now, not ever. The light flared again, brighter than before, stronger. The shadows screamed, their form flickering and warping, and for a moment they seemed to falter, to hesitate. And then, with a single, defiant breath, the light shattered the darkness completely, filling the forest with a brilliance that wiped out every shadow in its path. For the first time, there was silence. No whispers, no growls, no creatures lurking in the dark. Just the gentle hum of the light, warm and steady. They had won. But as her mother held Emily close, her heart still pounding in her chest, she knew one thing. The shadows might be gone, but they would always be there, waiting in the corners of the world. And they would never stop fighting for the light. But neither would she. Neither would they. The silence that followed was almost deafening. The once oppressive darkness had been obliterated, and the clearing was bathed in a calm, golden light that seemed to push every lingering shadow into the farthest corners of the forest. For the first time in what felt like forever, her mother could breathe without the crushing weight of fear pressing down on her chest. Emily stood beside her, her hand still firmly in hers, her small body trembling slightly from the adrenaline that hadn't quite worn off. But her eyes were clear now, no longer filled with the confusion and terror they had once carried. They were filled with something else, something stronger. Hope. Her mother looked down at her, heart swelling with pride. They had done it. They had fought together and won. The dark presence, the shadows, the creatures, they were all gone. For now, at least. She gazed around at the forest one last time. It was peaceful now. The trees, once twisted and hostile, stood still, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The air was crisp and fresh, the heavy, suffocating feeling lifted. The battle had ended, and the world was, for a moment, whole again. "Mom," Emily's voice broke through her thoughts, soft but full of wonder. "We're really safe now." Her mother knelt down to her level, looking into her daughter's eyes. "Yes, Emily, we're safe." But even as the words left her lips, she knew that peace could never be permanent. Darkness had a way of coming back, of finding cracks in the light. It always would. But they had learned something important, something they could carry with them. They had the strength to face it. Together. Emily smiled, her small face lighting up with the kind of joy that only comes after surviving the worst. "I'm glad we have each other." Her mother's heart softened as she pulled Emily close, holding her tightly. The world was still uncertain, still filled with shadows. But there was a new understanding between them. They had crossed a line, and though the future would hold challenges, they would face them as a team. The light, the pendant, the battle, it was over. But their journey wasn't. With the last of the shadows gone, they walked forward, side by side, into the bright unknown, ready for whatever came next. And this time, they were ready.